can't find it, so I don't know.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Kristevan Approaches to the Caribbean. Our first speaker today, Professor Rosa Tezanos-Pinto, unfortunately could not be here with us due to circumstances beyond her control, but she does send her regards and her regrets. Our first speaker today will be Professor Benigno Trigo, who is a member of the faculty of the Spanish and Portuguese department here at Vanderbilt University. He's also the editor of the recent book, Kristeva's Fiction. And the title of his talk is In Love with Our Own Undoing, Scenes from Puerto Rico's Tragic Imagination. Our second speaker, Professor Kristien Van Haesendonck, is a member of the Faculty of Comparative Studies at the University of Lisbon. He is the author of the book Encanto o Espanto, Identidad y Nación en la Novela Puertorriqueña Actual. And he's also the editor of the book Caribbean Configurations, Comparing Caribbeans, which is currently in press at Puerto. His talk today is titled Dancing with Diderot, Humanism at the Crossroads in Latin America and the Caribbean. We will allow each speaker to give their presentation, and then we will have a period of questions immediately following. So, welcome everyone, and let's begin. Professor Trigo.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. This essay is part of a book about a repeating theme of self-undoing in the cultural production of Puerto Rico during the 20th century. I was going to begin with a clip that featured Cornel West at the University of Puerto Rico talking about Lolita Lebron. But I can't, the PowerPoint is not cooperating, so I can't show you the clip. The one thing I wanted to comment on regarding this was the fact that Lolita Lebron is known for, first for attacking Congress in 1954. And second, for a phrase that made her famous. She said, I did not come to kill, I came to die for Puerto Rico. Cornel West goes to the University of Puerto Rico, this was a year ago, and he tells this story, and he talks about Lolita Lebron, and he makes an ironic joke. And the audience laughs after he makes the joke, which has to do with the fact that Lolita said the Lord's Prayer before she made a move in the US Congress. And he's talking about the prophetic slice is the concept that he's deploying here. And he gets laughter from the audience after he uses this line. So I'm interested in this laughter that the audience gives out during Cornel West's presentation. I believe the laughter betrays an uncanny affect that accompanies the repetition of a scene of self-undoing. And I believe that irony is what allows the Puerto Rican audience both to release this strange affect and also to bond with Cornel West. Other examples of this scene include René Marquez's scene of self-castration in La Popa del Barco. En La Popa del Barco hay un cuerpo reclinado from 1959. Luis Rafael Sánchez's account of self-immolation in his play La Pasión según Antígona Pérez from 1968. Manuel Ramos Otero's masochistic invitation in Vida Ejemplar del Esclavo y el Señor from 1975, and the identification with the abject of writers like Larry LaFontaine and David Caleb Acevedo in fictions like La Mierda, Shit, from 2009, and Diario de una puta humilde, from 2012. The scene of self-undoing is in part a form of the paradoxical colonial logic that Fanon so famously diagnosed and also forgave in his works. Fanon asks how to explain the abnormal defensiveness of the Caribbean black man in the 20th century, his attitude of being already on guard before conflict ever arises, when he has never had any relations with the white man, when there is a complete identification with the white man, when there has been no real trauma, when the modern Caribbean black man has not seen his father beaten or lynched by a white man. He answers that there is an early and imaginary trauma, or a trauma of the imagination, that explains this so-called abnormal defensiveness. At first, Fanon suggests that the trauma of the Caribbean man is no different from that of the European subject, diagnosed by Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Like Freud, Fanon suggests that there is an archaic and paradoxical tendency in man to repeat unpleasurable situations in order to master a deadly bodily impulse. In other words, the very compulsion to repeat unpleasure in childhood games and dreams is an attempt to work through an overpowering principle that is beyond pleasure, according to Freud. Elaborating on this psychoanalytic model, Fanon explains that the development of a collective consciousness requires a similar imaginary practice to release or channel the often sadistic aggression against the otherwise internal and normal threats of the death drive to consciousness. That is to say, in order to master the bodily impulses. The imagination performs what Fanon calls a necessary cathartic function by generating defensive images for both the consciousness and for the threats sustained by that consciousness. The aggression, Fanon continues, is often represented by an agency that is the very opposite of the threat. In this way, the European subject imagines a white, active, and good mind as threatened, haunted, and fascinated by a black, passive, and evil body. It does so in order to return agency to a subject who feels mastered by its death drive. But Fanon takes the psychoanalytic model further by transposing it to the context of colonization. In the colonial context, the operation of these phobic fabrications is significantly altered by the fact that in them the agency becomes identical with the threat. In other words, the colonized identifies himself simultaneously with the agent of the aggression and with the object of its sadism. The young colonized subjects who consume these fantasies then invest the heroes of their imaginary dramas with a self-violent agency, with a sadistic aggression that they act out and aim squarely at their abject selves. The doubleness of this imaginary practice is what is distinct about the colonial version of the psychoanalytic drama, as this doubleness explains the hypersensitivity of the colonial subject according to Fanon. The fact that they imagine themselves as simultaneously occupying the position of the good agent and the evil object puts them in an awkward position. They don't act out their aggression against an imaginary other, they act it out against their imaginary self. That is to say, the only act of defense or mastery that is possible for the colonial subject is an act that undermines the seat of that very defense and mastery. And their position is made even more awkward by the fact that the colonial subject is already on guard before conflict even arises. In other words, the colonial subject arrives at a scene that has been already imagined for him. He hurts himself before there is a need for protection. From his perspective, the scathing denunciations, the outpourings of misery, and the heated words of the poetry and tragedy of nationalist literature during the period of decolonization repeat the earlier fictions of the colonial period. But the fact that they take the paradoxes of the imagination to a feverish point, the fact that they reach the extreme of self-violence, also makes an important difference. Insofar as they are fictions of their own making, nationalist tragedies of self-undoing are different from the colonial fictions after which they are modeled. And this difference makes it possible for the colonized to avoid acting out the trauma, the problematic aggression, or the hypersensitivity that overdetermine their actions. In this way, nationalist poetry and tragedy helps to clear the air, even if it also steals the thunder from a necessary struggle, according to Fanon. The scene of self-undoing also represents two sides of a symbiotic and passionate embrace that Slavoj Žižek has described in another context as an archaic form of slave morality. Žižek writes that, quote, Christianity is the true religion of the superego, suggesting that the excessive mercy of Christianity generates an agency of absolute power. He further suggests that Christianity produces a Nietzschean slave morality in the sense that the Christian master will not admit he is the master. But Christianity also leads to the unmasking of this very morality, insofar as it leads to an absolute radical politics, according to Žižek. How? Christianity generates an embrace of this absolute power based on an unforgivable crime, according to Žižek. He uses Sophocles' Antigone as an example of absolute radical political opposition, suggesting that slave morality predates Christianity. For Žižek, Antigone's self-violence is the mirror image of Creon's absolute power, an absolutely radical act that by its very excess calls into question the slave morality or the mercy of Creon's regime. The scene of self-undoing repeats what Charles Shepardson describes as the tragic way of thinking. That is also the dramatic lesson of Sophocles' Antigone. In Shepherdson's reading of the play, Creon is a tragic hero. Like Antigone, Creon is a descendant of the disobedient Laius, the father of Oedipus. Creon is destined to be punished by the gods. The story of the play is the story of a divine vengeance exacted on the house of Labdacus. It is the story of what Sophocles calls ate, the story of a pollution that extends beyond Laius, Oedipus, or Creon, a family curse passed on across generations. This fate is clear to the audience of the tragedy, according to Shepardson, but not to Creon, the legitimate ruler of thieves. In fact, Creon's tragic flaw is that his hubris doesn't allow him to understand his role in the play. Creon is a clever man. He is particularly clever with words, but he is oblivious to their tragic meaning. He promises to the chorus that his actions will speak for him, that actions speak louder than words. And yet, Creon's tragic actions are in fact the effect of his obliviousness to the meaning of the story that frames him. Creon is oblivious to the point of arrogantly disavowing the ambiguity of words. Action speaks louder than words, Creon says. And the audience smiles, knowing better. Shepherdson argues that Creon embodies the view of man according to tragedy. Man as Deinon, or as self-undoing. In tragedy, man is too clever for his own good. He is inventive and disastrous at the same time. His clever words have the opposite meaning that they ostensibly carry. Shepherdson suggests we should heed the lesson of tragedy, as Creon does by the end of the play, when he hears of the death of Eurydice. For Shepherdson, language is a strange dyad that couples the words of Creon with the tones of a woman. The language is for Shepherdson the carrier of an eerie music, an uncanny poetry, a negativity, and an undoing that is closer to us than we might want to admit. The scene of self-undoing of the Puerto Rican imagination also includes the transformation of an uncanny and troubling affect into language. Kelly Oliver gives a detailed account of this transformation of bodily impulses into words. And she insists that this transformation must take a social form if there is to be an antidote to what she calls the colonization of psychic space. In Oliver's account of the play by Sophocles, Antigone's crime is her sexuality. And Oliver suggests that this objection of the female body and the shame that it injects into the body of women is an archaic model for later forms of domination and subjection, including colonization. In a provocative reading of Fanon, Oliver argues that the domination inherent in colonization is similar to the treatment of Antigone by Sophocles. Following Fanon, she argues that colonization is a series of long-standing social practices of shaming that hollow out the psyche of the colonized subject, that injects the hollowed out core with a phobic and cruel superego, and that finally secretes an artifact that is made self-violent. The malady of the secreted artifact is that it can no longer transform its bodily impulses into words. By contrast, a subject that is able to question authority is a subject that transforms its bodily impulses into words. To question authority in this sense is to allow the expression of the unconscious bodily impulse or affect, even in the face of a form of domination that abjects the body. Such questioning is an antidote to the colonization of psychic space in two specific ways. First, it profoundly undermines the illusion of sovereignty that subtends all authority. Questioning has its source and origin in the body, in the unconscious bodily affects, rather than in the mind. Second, questioning interrupts the collapse of the ego of the colonized and its injection with a cruel superego by transforming the negativity of the unconscious bodily impulse into the positive force of sublimation. But this positive outcome, she insists, is the result of a refusal to give primacy to either the body or to language. Most importantly, questioning depends on trusting that an accepting and supportive social attitude pre-exists, precedes, and antedates the subject. The belief in the pre-existence of the necessary conditions of possibility for the transfer of these affects or the sublimation of bodily drives. Characteristically, such social trust is modeled on our relations to the maternal body, and Oliver calls this trust forgiveness. The scene of self-undoing is a return to objection, the bond that makes subjectivity possible, according to Kristeva. The scene of self-undoing is an elaboration in language of the familiar pollution that Sophocles called ate in Antigone, a paradoxical border that exists before the law, a place both fascinating and cruel. It is a form of the jolt of the newborn. If the object is a negative force that pulls the newborn towards a place where meaning collapses, then objection is its reduplication, a reflex of the body of the newborn that tries to expel the object. But objection is also a lesson learned in intimate relation with that not yet object, that Kristeva calls an intimate revolt. And the repeating scene of self-undoing is a redoubling and an elaboration of the bodily reflex and of this lesson in the context of that historical objection called colonization. The scene of self-undoing in the American century is an example of that jolt or reflex transformed into the not that of the Puerto Rican dramatic subject. The scene of self-undoing in Puerto Rican cultural production also reveals a regression of the subject to the archaic point of abjection. The regression suggests that the social support that helps the subject continue its struggle with the object is waning in Puerto Rico. If the force of the contradictory process of objection is easing, this suggests that the social context does not support the expression of objection and that the accompanying process of sublimation is becoming dangerously impoverished. But the repetition of the scene of self-undoing also suggests that the original repression has found a means to express and transform itself. Perhaps thanks to a social, cultural, political, and economic context where the work of art is still possible. Perhaps thanks to alternative communities where the expression of objection is still welcome and encouraged. Kristeva states that the psychoanalytic interpretation offers a form of forgiveness that she calls pardon. Something that happens through a gift, through a position that allows listening without judgment. The scene of self-undoing of the Puerto Rican tragic imagination is a form of this forgiveness. It does not fight or submit to the object. It does not evacuate the hatred contained in objection. Instead, it dismantles the cogs of negativity that threaten to make humanity stop, but also make it work. Psyche, history, language and the body. Thank you very much.
So we'll now take questions from Professor Trigo.
Let's turn on the lights. I guess the lights are over there.
I wonder if there in this point of forgiveness, and could you say that the function of the chorus is
Very nice, yes.
Is listening without judging?
Yes, yes. I think that ultimately the chorus and the audience are both figures for that position. The position, ultimately, the position in the couch and with the annals, the position of the transference and counter-transference, the position that Kristeva calls it grace. That is the, yes, indeed, the chorus and also the audience, who is aware and can laugh at Creon's his foolhardiness. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Professor Trigo. So my question, I really enjoyed the talk and thinking about Fanon and in relation to Kristeva, and I was wondering if you could say a bit about the way you were describing Professor Oliver's account of Fanon and of the secretion of race, because if I'm thinking of one of the moments in which he describes the use of the phrase "I secrete my race," it's just prior to mentioning Senghor and negritude poetry. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the relationship, the role of poetry in the work of Fanon and the work of Kristeva, and the way that you see those as being related or divergent from one another.
That's a very good question. For Fanon, I guess that I read or I interpret Oliver's reading of Fanon as a very forgiving reading of Fanon. I think that her interpretation of Fanon is calling attention to certainly a part of Fanon's work that Fanon himself problematizes. I think his reading of nationalist literature is one such moment. And his reading of negritude is one such moment. What he's trying to do, I think, is try to explain, and in a sense, I mean, if you take Oliver's line, then he's also trying to forgive the paradox of negritude. And he's trying to explain it psychoanalytically. In so doing, explaining it. The sort of one way of talking about it would be the exotization of the African in the movement of negritude. So he wants to, on the one hand, criticize it, and on the other hand, he wants to explain it and forgive it. He wants to understand why this happens. And so the secretion of race, negritude is an example of the secretion of race, which is something that comes out of colonial relations. And it's inherently paradoxical, inherently self-violent, self-undoing, and ultimately inevitable given the colonial context. And he wants to read, one way of reading Fanon is trying to read against the grain of that output as only symptomatic and problematic. He wants to also see something in it that can be used. And if for nothing else, to understand the psychoanalytic model that explains it or gives it birth. So I'm trying, I mean, Kristeva's account of, you could argue that Kristeva's account of the poetic as both, as you could say that it's both symptom and work, does something similar, or I'm trying to make the connection between the two. But they are both talking about the poetic or talking about art in a similarly paradoxical way, as both symptomatic and also as work, necessary work. And it can go in opposite ways. You make a, I guess that you make a wager, and you hope that it goes in the right direction, but you don't know where it's going. And I think that that would be similar in Fanon and in Kristeva from this particular reading of Fanon. That is, I think, very forgiving.
Could you elaborate on similitudes or differences between Kristeva's pardon, forgiveness, and Derrida's pardon?
I'm not very familiar with Derrida's pardon, so I couldn't. Sorry.
Well, I think if any additional questions come up, we can address them at the end of the talk. At the next talk, we'll have a little bit of time. So I think we can move on now to our second speaker, Professor Kristien Van Haesendonck. And as I said before, the title of his talk is Dancing with Diderot, Humanism at the Crossroads in Latin America and the Caribbean. Professor Van Haesendonck.
I'm going to try to respect the 20 minutes that I have, because that's my main challenge now. For everything else, I would like to thank Professor Trigo for this invitation to the panel and to Vanderbilt, because otherwise I would simply be here. So very excited to be here these days for this conference. And so thanks again also to sponsors, Oliver, and the departments that have been helping me to come here. So yeah, let's go to the topic of my paper. I was thinking, like, it's maybe classical that the idea that my paper had the title Diderot, Dancing with Diderot, I would keep that part, but then the humanism part, I've been sliding a bit away of that. I'm not really going to talk much about humanism, humanistic topic in Kristeva or in the Caribbean. Actually, I came up with a short title lately that I said that would be better for my paper, so it would be Caribbean Cora. So if you want as a subtitle to Dancing with Diderot, that's still better. Anyway, in order not to keep you waiting, I'll try to go to the point, but I'd like to make a polylogue, an essay first published in the journal Tel Quel 1974. Kristeva wrote the following words, which sound familiar to us. Indeed, they could well have been written in 2014, and I quote, "Listening to the time of age, I listened to the globe spread out at last, Asia, Africa, America, Europe, inextricably entangled in economics, politics, radio, television, and satellites, each having a chronology which, instead of obediently finding its niche in the succession, interpolates the other and points out its lacks, all the while desiring it for a partner, each comprised of differentiated semiotic practices, myths, religions, art, poetry, politics, whose hierarchy is never the same, each system questioning the hierarchy of the others. The subject who listens to this time can, in effect and at least, treat itself as a sonata, as H writes." End of quote. Inextricably entanglement of continents and cultures, entanglement of technologies, hyper-connected individuals, competing semiotic systems, questioning the hierarchy of the others. Two more passages in her essay, which is an analysis of Soler's novel H. Kristeva describes the polylogic subject as emerging out of an unpredictable eruption of a shock, a clash in relation to the other. The polylogue states, she says, "I, truth, have the right to lie in the form that sings me, for this polylogical I speaks of a before, which is not even unconscious, a before, all before unconscious, shock, gush, death, clash, then, stasis of sound, then, heterogeneity of the representamen, other, language, I, all between quotation marks, speech, then, eruption of the shock, of the gush, of death, end quote. Kristeva, he said, points indeed to a semiotic explosion, an explosion of languages. She says, what you take for the explosion of language is the explosion of body. Be sure not to mistake yourself for someone or something. You are in the explosion. You exist to explode. The time of age Kristeva suggested might well have become reality. The passages I just quoted might well be read as definition avant la lettre of the phenomenon called cultural creolization, much before the latter became fashionable in critical theory. Both cultural and linguistic creolization implies neither a harmonious encounter nor a smooth blending, but a cultural or linguistic clash. The result is a collision of particles, some of which are easily recognizable, while others remain more difficult, but not impossible to trace. As was the case with the Bottompeaks, if you remember recently, the famous God particle. So creolization inevitably reminds the master-slave dialectic a hierarchical relationship which is at the same time present and questioned. In an unstoppable drive towards the creation of a creole object whose outcome is unpredictable. And that's an idea that Edouard Glissant, a writer from Martinique, defends fiercely, that the result of realization is always unpredictable. Among the poetic myriad of images Kristeva evoked in Polydor, these words also remind her description of Diderot as l'homme qui s'éclate, a libertarian and revolutionary of the mind, who centuries before our times was engaged in the multiplication of experiences. In a way, the creolized subject, or creole subject, is also such a homme éclaté or exploded subject. In a similar fashion to Kristeva, French curator Nicolas Bourriaud speaks of a multicultural explosion in his essay on the Alter Modern. He says, our civilization, which bears the imprints of a multicultural explosion and the proliferation of cultural strata, resembles a structureless constellation awaiting transformation into an archipelago. This global chaotic process then of mixing of cultures might indeed have become reality, and many names have been given to it: hybridization, transculturation, métissage, creolization, and so on. Now, Martinican author Edouard Glissant speaks of this as the tout monde, a new world order, which is chaotic, literally would be translated something like the whole world. This is, I refer to his Traité du tout monde, treaty of the whole world. I don't think the book has been translated yet, but should be translated anytime, I think, because major works by Glissant have been published. So let's hope for that. And he defines this tout monde as the world becoming creolized, where cultural archipelagos connect around the globe. Julia Kristeva coins the term multiverse, and turns it into the eighth principle for the 21st century's humanism. And this is my translation of this principle. She says, there is no universe anymore. Scientific research discovers and does not stop to probe the multiverse. Multiplicity of cultures, of religions, of tastes and creations, multiplicities of cosmic spaces, of matters and energies, living together with the void, creating with the void. Translate the V as the void, perhaps could also be translated as nothingness. In case she continues, don't be afraid of the immortal, of the incapable of thinking the multiverse. Humanism faces an epochal task, tâche épocale, inscribing mortality in the multiverse of the living and the cosmos. End quote. Kristeva sees the emergence of the multiverse as opposed to the universe and universalism, which still largely dominated the 20th century. This multiverse of multiplicities of cultures, religions, creations, as well as cosmic spaces, matters and energies, is not purely an abstract, imaginary, or utopian space. The explosion of the universe into the multiverse, to which he already refers to in Polydor, this multiplication of languages is also a questioning of the symbolic at large and a tool for surviving the crisis of the Western mind. To understand this multiverse from a Caribbean perspective, then, I suggest a detour or diversion, to use Edouard Glissant's term, as a way to come to a better understanding of the multiverse as a realizing space and of its inhabitant kaleidoscopic subject. Instead of a one-way Kristevan approach and Caribbean culture, I believe it would be fruitful to explore the dialogue or polylogue between our work and theoretical perspectives by Caribbean and other theorists, thus putting into practice the creolization of theory, as Françoise Loreina and Shumeishi call it. And more particularly, I argue that there is an interesting link between how Caribbean intellectuals have used chaos theory to describe Caribbean, what they see as a fractalic economic space, and Kristeva's own use of the metaphor, to describe the semiotic. The point I'd like to make then is that the Caribbean can be compared in many senses to this unnameable receptacle or semiotic space to which Kristeva refers as Kora, a maternal receptacle which functions as rhythmic space prior to language and the symbolic. Kora as a metaphorical space then of mobility and displacement of meaning, but also as a space determined by the mobility and displacement of the subject itself either through exile, migration, or diaspora. At the same time, it competes then with nourishing forms and maternal dependencies that characterize the Caribbean's post-colonial condition. So this is more or less the point I'd like to make, this Caribbean Kora. What is it exactly? And I would like to refer to what critics already said, that Kristeva is very much aware of the difficulty, the contradiction in trying to theorize such a difficult concept as the Kora, a contradiction located in the heart of the semiotic enterprise. Kristeva explicitly wrote that, quote, although the Kora can be designated and regulated, it can never be definitely posited. As a result, one can situate the Kora and, if necessary, lend it a topology, but one can never give it axiomatic form, end quote. Similar difficulties at stake for those who oppose the Caribbean. One can situate the Caribbean in geographical terms, cultural terms, which is not as obvious as it seems, or in terms of national identity, and so on. But one cannot posit it, one cannot give it axiomatic form. According to Caribbean intellectuals, at least, we can theorize as much as we want. They say that we'll never reach a point of definition or delimitation of what the Caribbean is. And that's why Benigno Trigo, Cuban intellectual Benigno Trigo, and so and others always start perhaps with a disclaimer, warning us about the difficulty, not to say the impossible mission, to formulate a theory of the Caribbean. And why they view the Caribbean as sort of great centrifuge of meanings, ad infinitum, Benigno Trigo says. And it's also why ultimately they draw on chaos theory, probably in an ultimate attempt to name the unnameable. I will note on creolization, because I've been mentioning very hastily many concepts. The specific process of linguistic and cultural content, known as creolization, has become popular across a number of disciplines, above all in anthropology, but more recently a wide range of disciplines, including colloquial studies and more recently literature also. A simplified view would consist in saying that the linguistics, where the concept stems from, a pidgin is what precedes a Creole language, and pidgin does not have a proper grammar, while Creole does have a proper grammar. But pidgin exists as a basic form of communication between two speakers who linguistically and culturally have very little in common with each other. So pidgins eventually can become a Creole, in other words, a language with a proper grammar. The process of creolization in linguistic terms, creolistics, is a process through which a new language emerges and bears a strong resemblance to Kristeva's semiotic, space-time that is prior to the symbolic. I should note that, or we should mention that Kristeva, for linguistic research, never used terms like creolization or pidgin or Creole, which, as I said, was first used in linguistics, but would become popular later in other fields as well. And perhaps this is also somewhat surprising, given her strong interest and expertise in linguistics, namely in pre- and paragrammatical processes. So we should also say perhaps that concept accounts for these entanglements. As when we speak about cultural creolization, it means that many connections are emerging on a cultural level to what Kristeva referred to as the globe spread out at last, what this are called the Care Monde. So the cultural creolization as a process of mixing on globe scale. In different parts of the globe, not just the whole globe is creolizing, but yes, that would be the process that is ongoing and definitely be happening according to this song. And also to Benigno Trigo, which is one is from Martinique, this song, and Benigno Trigo from Cuba. They have very similar, they make very similar points drawing on chaos theory. But to connect this to the Caribbean choral as sort of space of polyrhythm, creolization, and carnival also. As you know, Pidgin's Creole languages, creolization, and Creole is créolité in French, are constitutive features of Caribbean culture, and not just Caribbean, but generally island cultures, Cape Verde or the Indian Ocean, and in Maurice, for example. But the kora in the Caribbean, more particularly, can manifest itself through the overwhelming presence of the carnivalesque and the rhythmic, in twisted representation of identity as impure and creolized, through laughter and self-deprecation, mimicry, and also overwhelming presence of the abject abjection, as I've been attempting to show in my book, Encanto Espanto, a study of Puerto Rican. So, more particularly, rhythm is, I think, important here to, at least for Cuban writer Antonio Benigno Trigo in Repeating Island. There's no better definition of rhythm, not just musical rhythm, but rhythm in general, than the one given by Léopold Sédar Senghor, which is le rythme c'est l'architecture de l'être. Rhythm is the architecture of being. And interestingly, for Senghor, one instrument is key in African rhythm, at least, and that's the kora with a K. So K-O, circumflex head on it. Kora as the main channel to transmit joy and sadness, pain and ecstasies. And this is not by coincidence then rhythm and carnival are also at the heart of Benigno Trigo's project to theorize the Caribbean as a meta-archipelago. Benigno Trigo puts special emphasis on the plantation as a cultural hotspot of realization, which repeats itself over the Caribbean basin. Caribbean, he says, consists of ritmo cruzado y caótico, chaotic rhythmic configuration, which he describes as with the term polyrhythm. So polyrhythm reminds also polylog, polyphone, but polyrhythm is like this multi-layered rhythm, which is very Caribbean in a way. As I said, he has this disclaimer. He also, at the end of his book, he concludes that, however, lo caribeño siempre quedará más allá del horizonte. Caribbeanness cannot be properly grasped. It will always be beyond the horizon. And one particular section now, I should perhaps watch the time a little, is relevant to my discussion here. Part 4 in Benigno Trigo's book is titled The Paradox. It includes a section entitled Naming the Father, Naming the Mother. We should specify, though, that Benigno Trigo delivers a psychoanalytic reading of the life of Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier, whose very identity and writing, he says, was based on his epistemological and linguistic attachment to Europe, especially France, which symbolized the father, the nom du père, as opposed to his discovery or rediscovery of and attachment to Mother America. Benigno Trigo describes it in Lacanian terms as, I quote Carpentier's, incomplete regression to the imaginary from the symbolic. Although focusing on Carpentier's life as a case study, Benito Trigo argues with caution that the same can be said of Caribbean writing at large. He does this with caution, I should emphasize this. Caribbean writers are caught in a paradox of being unable to decide between naming the mother and naming the father. Mother stands for the imaginary, music, nature, and folklore, the absence of violence, and on the other hand, a father figure, which is a bit more puzzling to me. Is it stand for the foreign or the absent father, perhaps? Because he only mentions or focuses on Carpentier, who had this European background, and then rediscovered the Antillian culture, which is the imaginary music, folklore, and so on. Benito Trigo, in any case, links Caribbean culture and literature to a Oedipal problem, although he does not use this term. He draws clearly on the Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalytical model. Curiously, while referring to the Caribbean's African legacy and the history of slavery, Benito Trigo's repeating island does not account for the broader picture. He says, for example, very little or almost nothing about contemporary historical and political context. Perhaps in a move to be more postmodern. Perhaps he sees just a more innovative point of view to rethink the Caribbean from a self-declared postmodern perspective. The subtitle of his book used to be El Caribe y la perspectiva postmoderna, so the Caribbean and the postmodern perspective. By substituting the weight of colonial history for a more dynamical, poetical view on the Caribbean, one cannot but think that the picture he draws is indeed refreshing and innovative, but also incomplete for leaving aside many unresolved issues. What happens, for example, with the current post-colonial entanglements and dependencies? Can we speak of a colonial/post-colonial matrix? Exception made of one chapter dedicated to Bartolomé de las Casas, referring once again to Freudian theory, uncanny. Benito Trigo makes very scarce reference to colonialism and omits the current debate on Caribbean identity. And what's somewhat surprising, because he starts his book, he announces the importance of, I quote, the different colonial experiences, so different kinds of colonialism that have affected the Caribbean over time. But then that's it, so he doesn't return to this. He prefers to draw on chaos theory to describe many expressions of Caribbean culture. And to finish, then, a Kristevan view of the Caribbean as Cora may offer then a more dynamic view of Caribbean culture than Benito Trigo's, at least from a psychoanalytic point of view. In general, it can be seen as a complementary to existing theories of the Caribbean, including postmodern ones, such as the one offered by Benito Trigo in his groundbreaking book, The Repeating Island. Caribbean experience learns that chaos is not necessarily auto-destructive, but creative. De cierta manera, as I said, in a certain way. That's how Benito Trigo also describes. But in any case, I could continue and talk about the implications that the polyrhythm and the polylogue have on both rethinking European identity, or Europeanness and Caribbeanness, or Caribbean identity. But that would perhaps take me too far. It is, however, important to point to the junctions or entanglements and connections between the polylogue and the polyrhythms, between the old and the new European and Caribbean cultures. And so what's been happening, and that's what I argue elsewhere, is that perhaps in Europe what's happening is now that there's sort of Caribbeanization in terms of multiplicity, kaleidoscopic subject, where Kristeva mentions and tries to elaborate when she's really concerned with European identity. And I think it has a sort of Caribbean sort of touch to it, or at least more. There is clearly links that could be studied also to rethink the Creole subject, the links between cosmopolitanism and Creoleness. François Lyonnais is doing much work in that sense. And to theorize the difficulties also of the Creole subject as a marginalized, perhaps not so happy hybrid subject in current times. Yeah, that's a bit what I would say. It's perhaps better to have some, answer some questions or doubts regarding things that I might have said a bit too fast or quickly. But in any case, many thanks for your attention.
We've got time for questions. Yes, go ahead, please.
For the first talk, and I think it would relate to the second as well. I'm having trouble formulating the link, but I was thinking of the Arendt volume, of the Feminine Genius trilogy, where she talks about the polis and theater. So, as I recall, there's a function that the chorus plays as a sort of mediating force between the chora and the polis, or between sort of the inorganic landscape that has a sort of mothering role, and between the polis, which has this civilizing role, or this role that brings to language. That's part of the fostering of the singularity of the individual through a struggle with the law. And I wondered if you had any thoughts of that specifically in the context of political theater for oppressed groups who are removed from the lands with which they identify, and as a way of reinstituting that mediation.
Interesting. Well, political theater can be many things. Depends on, I guess it would be a question of style. I heard a talk earlier today that was a very interesting intervention using Bertolt Brecht's notion of estrangement in theater, which is one style of political theater that could have the effect, I think, that Kristevan might be looking after. Not so other types of political theater that are theaters that are engaged in a kind of hyper-representational or very heavy-handed attempt at putting forth a political message. So depends on the form of the theater. It would play that role. A tragedy would be also perhaps a mode of theater for, according to my talk, that would lend itself to this kind of, say, productive work, more so than other types of theater, again, for the reasons that I tried to describe in the talk.
Thank you.
A matter of style.
Yeah, I would.
I'm not sure that
I'm sorry, I couldn't do the work of making the link, but if you can, I'm happy to have the work done for me.
I think you could have answered the question than Mr. Trigo. So, I don't know if I got the question right, or in any case.
I guess I would have a question regarding making the parallel and connection between Cora and the Caribbean. What is at stake for you in making that connection? What does it do for you to make that parallel between the Caribbean and Cora? Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, I see with all these expressions, the carnivalesque, which is so important for Kristeva, and not just, of course, not in the Caribbean context, but say in the European novel, completely said, hey, this is where you comparing Caribbean to, but yeah, the carnivalesque, for example, in the European novel, it shows also that there is, and she links it to the semiotic, so. It could be thought of since this overwhelming presence of not just carnival, but rhythm, imaginary, the abject also. It makes me think that Caribbean, and this perhaps sounds like a stretch or huge generalization, but Caribbean as Cora could be seen as a sort of space of survival, perhaps, that breaks this symbolic, which I'm not sure if it's like colonial fodder, because if you see current colonial or post-colonial matrix, if we can use that word too, which has been used in many senses, like Caribbean space as violated by colonialism, as a sort of Caribbean womp that, but right now in postmodern times it's perhaps more a nourishing maternal function that it has. So it seems that this Caribbean as Cora seems to contest at least with other forms of maternal dependencies, if I can use that term, like colonialism. And the problem with this whole vocabulary surrounding colonialism is that we are stuck within these terms, and there are so many types of colonialism. I've been using the term colonialismo light also to refer to cases Puerto Rico or Martinique or Curaçao, Dutch Antillean islands, which is perhaps, another form of dependencies. But we are stuck in this vocabulary of colonization, colonialism, and creolization perhaps is a sort of going beyond this binarism. But to come back to the Cora, I just tried to see if it's not more productive than falling back in this Freudian, Lacanian model between naming the father and naming the mother, as Benito clearly draws on this kind of rigid structure. So it offers more flexibility to describe perhaps what I've been using this term abject and abjection also very carefully, I think, because it can be also seen more in other ways than just say the average Gothic novel, which uses the term when scholars that use the Gothic or describe the Gothic novel recur very easily to the abject. It has to become a bit, been used in this unilateral or watered down way, if I can say that. Realization, unfortunately, also. So trying to find a new creative way to connect, Caribbean culture to an alternative model than the ones that have been used before. And creolization, perhaps if done carefully, could be useful to connect. I said Cora as a space of creolization, because there's clearly all the semiotic expressions or phenomena taking place, but it's, as I said, very difficult to pin down or to posit. as we know, with many of Kristeva's concepts, but I think it's one way to explore.
I was just wondering, I've been very struck by how intense the search is for new kinds of spaces in a global context where things feel so locked down. Maybe the nation state is disappearing and the corporate state is ascending. However one looks at it, there's this sort of desire to find spaces that speak to some other kind of future, some other kind of disruption. And I think of it often in terms of archipelagos. Hadn't thought about putting the notion of the Cora and the Caribbean together so closely, but it seems to be part of that search to redefine spaces that have been over-defined. And I'm wondering about these spaces of forgiveness. You mentioned the chorus, the state of grace, the couch, which is one of Kristeva's favorite places of forgiveness, and the audience. Are there others? And is there a way to think about these two kinds of spaces together, or is that just too much of a stretch? Or at least the search for these new spaces that can somehow disrupt these combats that we're locked in, that Fanon so brilliantly described, I think.
Can you tell me more about the two kinds of spaces you just mentioned?
I was trying to make a link between the two papers, and what was coming into my head was just these ideas, this idea of searching for spaces globally, where there's a kind of new form of new forms of subjectivity, new forms of imagination that might disrupt the global script. And then I was very struck by this notion of these spaces of forgiveness, spaces where this judgment lets up a little bit. If you're on the couch with an analyst you trust.
Yeah,
Or all of that. I'm just trying to.
Yeah. Well, I think that the two talks are complementary. Perhaps that's what you're getting at. They are complementary approaches, and perhaps from very different perspectives, to the same problem that you seem to be delineating. If I had to make some kind of connection or maybe an intervention regarding the different qualities of these two approaches, it would be along the following lines. I think that you can perhaps look for an alternative model in an archipelagic model, which would be a broad and sort of boundless kind of gesture, or you could go the opposite way, which would, instead of looking for the archipelago, you could be looking for the island, and you could be then sort of insisting on the singularity and the question of loss of the archipelago as that which then provides for a kind of melancholy and ethical position, which that would be. I mean, I'm thinking about the Beast and the Sovereign essay and Derrida's kind of meditation about the island and Porcelan's phrase. The world is lost, therefore I must carry you. It's that kind of ethical commitment that comes from the insistence on the loss of the world that I think my approach speaks to more. And I think that the archipelagic approach goes in the opposite direction, perhaps, and perhaps do the same kind of work, but doing it in a very different direction than mine would. So thank you for that.
way also to accept the archipelago or archipelagic thinking that pensée archipélique, c'est this encore. It's a way of accepting also poetic notion of the Caribbean. It's like water skill, but the problem might be if we accept too much of poetic definition of what the Caribbean is like. It doesn't do away with historical political conflicts and struggle perhaps, or for ways for survival that are real at the same time. So the context that perhaps now we insist very much on postmodern perspective, mostly glissant, but personally I think it's very important also to return to or to take into account the current political and historical context of the different Caribbeans, or is it one Caribbean that we have? So, yeah, I don't want just to underline the poetic potential of these concepts, but I was wondering perhaps also if would you apply this undoing, could that be said also of other Caribbean continents, beyond Puerto Rico?
Absolutely. Oh, I think that's
Hispanic
one.
Caribbean, but also the Dutch Caribbean.
Yeah, of course. There's and part of the undoing has to do with precisely the loss of the world. And this loss of the world, or that I was referring to before, has to do with the island and the identification with the island. And this happens in Puerto Rico, it happens in Martinique, I think it happens in Curaçao, I think it happens in Tennessee, by the way. But I think in the Caribbean context, perhaps this is more dramatic and perhaps more tragic, perhaps because of history, or tragic in a very particular way because of history. But yes, I think that, I mean, you've mentioned in the past that you quote some a Curaçao intellectual saying that the thing that every Caribbean island has in common is that they all forget there's other islands in the Caribbean.
One criterion is the ignorance of one another.
And that's absolutely the case. I mean, that is absolutely the case. And I agree that it should be the case in a sense, because it does tell us the story of what, of the place of forgetting that every one of these Caribbean islands holds this story, tells this story, the forgetting, and based on the loss of a world. And this is something that brings us together in a weird way. It does.
To follow up on what you were saying, I was thinking whether the Torah would be concept that worked really well for the Caribbean, for the diaspora. I was thinking of the desire to return to the land, to the islands. And I was thinking of perhaps the film of Marquez, Le Bonheur des Arts. But we can take on the Cahier du Retour au Pays Natal,
So it applies diaspora.
The Quora would be that the same link with the cosmetic investment that one wants to explore and return to, and it's a great one.
That's a very good question. I never didn't ask, but I've been thinking about this idea of mobility.
But that return to some sort of maternal, or I don't know, something closer to the origin, one's childhood.
Yeah, the verb, this term origins, it's indeed this idea of return. The two in Natal, Glissant is very much trying to avoid the the idea of one-way return, going back. And diaspora is much more flexible and dynamic than this idea of migration, one-way movement. But I would definitely see that, and I think I mentioned it before, diaspora as linked to the Quora, but I'm not sure what ways. Perhaps as like as you tour to the other countries. Yeah.
You answer, right? Maybe the Quora, the diaspora, the Caribbean Quora works well, or has more meaning for the diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, than in Africa for
Promise.
which we work the places also for our diaspora.
Yeah, but this has all to do with the limits of the, where do you draw the line of the Caribbean as a nation? I think that, as Juan Flores puts it, the diaspora is dynamic extension of the Caribbean, and also of light colonialism. He also uses this term. It's not just a geographical term, determined concept. So it's just, I would definitely see the more flexible terms.
I could just sort of intervene in what you said. I'm just wondering if I'm recalling correctly, Benigno Trigo wrote that book in London, right?
Repeating Island.
Right.
Yeah.
He was in London when he was not in Cuba when he wrote it, right? I'm trying to remember because that it really would sort of work with what you're saying.
I don't know where he was.
But I know that he did at some point sort of try to separate himself from Cuba. And so there's that whole conflict there and sort of the memory and who I was there and who I am now. And I think that really can work well with that. Especially because he seems to posit the Caribbean as such a gendered space. Like he really does. He posits the Caribbean as Cuba. He sort of uses Cuba as the Caribbean space par excellence, and then he sort of locates the Caribbean in the female body. Right? Saying de cierta manera, he's talking about how these Afro-Cuban women are walking, and he's sort of locating it in a very specific gender and racialized.
What I want to avoid is like to accept or embrace Walter Milo's notion of I am where I think, because that's very dangerous. Accept say that the Caribbean subject per se is producing archaeological thought. So even though he says that it's a geographical concept, I don't want to criticize or return this to critique of Mignolo, but I think that's very dangerous. After all, if you insist on I am where I think, you're very much saying that as a Caribbean subject, you have to produce post-colonialist, post-Occidentalist thought and archaeological thought. I mentioned that yesterday during my talk. So I would see this in more positive ways. So Caribbean Quora is sort of also optimistic notion, but that has sometimes takes into account all forms of objection of Caribbean subject as a not so as a form of hybridity, which is more complex than the happy versions that we have of the hybrid identities, postmodern times. It also renders the suffering of the Creole subject today. And I think Kristeva also refers to that, multilingual and kaleidoscopic subject. In interviews, she stresses this. Suffering also, so I think that's also important to stress. It's just the space of pleasure. That she speaks of questionable restlessness subject. So to be multilingual queeralized, so that it's like sort of lepricide, she also mentions this, as a painful destiny, and so on. But I just mentioned that this could be linked in more ways to what Kristeva describes in a way the European circuit. So I really try to make links between incomparable spaces, not just in post-colonial spaces, but said Europe and the Caribbean. The first book I thought, and I'm talking too much. So.
We've got another question. I just want to make sure everyone gets
Sure.
a chance to ask you what they'd like to ask.
Oh, I just wanted to respond to Dr. Biale's question. That I wonder if we can think of the Odyssey and Oedipus as two founding narratives of Cora. One being the ideal sort of, one being the colonial narrative, and the other being the incestual one. So like, in the Odyssey, everything goes the way it should for the patriarchal colonizing figure who, the chaste wife remains at home. He wanders. He goes to each island. No island knows the other. They never get together at a convention. And he comes back, and everything is much as it was. He hasn't changed in the sense of having taken on anything from those lands. And he's able to return to the nurturing woman at home. Whereas in the Oedipus trilogy, everything goes wrong. There isn't the distance that the colonial linear narrative provides that allows him to keep the gap alive between the Cora and himself. So the problem of incest is a problem of a too intimate, too soon relation to the Cora. That he never leaves it, but he is bound by fate to return to it in a perverse directness, in which he actually marries the mother and has children with the mother. So I wonder if we can conceive of colonialism in that way as the aversion to mixture and creolism as an aversion to that loss of distance, that loss of the gap which protects me from the vulnerability of my relation to the mother.
Write that down quickly, yes?
Okay, I don't want to.
But also, François Zionnet was just visiting us at Harvard, and there was a lot of conversation about Fortress Europe at the moment, and this sort of, I'm a little obsessed with these boundaries that are closing. But France right now, for instance, is closing its boundaries and is actually creating islands in its interior, which are essentially immigration camps. I learned more than I wanted to know in a very short time about this process that's going on, largely invisible. Talk about, Zizek and Desert of the Real. I mean, these little islands, these little camps are basically invisible to most of the world. And so I was thinking about what you were saying, and then I was thinking about Kristeva's public conversation, at least, about immigration and about European identity and about this hybridity. But I was just wondering if either of you had any thoughts about her public theorization on subjectivity and hybridity and the current situation, for example, in her place of speech, which is France, and in relationship to obviously to the Caribbean. I don't know if that's a question or just a series of associations, but
Is your question perhaps addressing the point of intervention? The difference between the public positions of Kristeva and what could be the clinical
Yeah, I think so.
therapeutic interventions of Kristeva,
Yeah, I think so.
and how to bridge them, or
Wondering if you
speak-
have any thoughts on it. Just,
speak to that
I haven't been able
difference.
to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I think that I've been asking myself the question of how do you bring this space of forgiveness that you were talking about into the public sphere. Clearly, what you're saying, not clearly, but I take what you're saying as that the islands can also be generated. I mean, the islands are the result of a larger context that is continuing to generate them, and that is political in nature, and that the sort of the description of the problem, as Kristeva seems to insist, does not address directly how to translate the intimate revolts that she is calling for, and the insistence on the island nature of the, say, analysand, and the meditation and reflection together with the analyst about that very peninsular, or I should say insular, rather than peninsular, the insular nature. How to translate that into policy, or into
public sphere,
or into, yeah. But I think that it's a tough question. I don't think that there is a post. I think that the only way that I can have been able to imagine it is by continuing to fund instruments or institutions that allow for those bridges to emerge, or for continuing to support programs that will insist on the importance of turning that sort of intimate struggle into something that can be seen at the level of the public eye. Continuing to insist on that, on whatever channels can magnify this struggle, but those channels are
The resistance is
disappearing.
high. Yes, the resistance
That's
is
the problem. Because it's counterintuitive. So yeah, it's, the thing is also that if you, I mean, another way of approaching it is by rethinking. Also, you can start rethinking colonization in such a way that will allow you to imagine it as not suffocating, but actually promising. If you can do that, and that is something that is politically, of course, very dangerous, but if you can do that, then in a context where the air is being taken out, suddenly you see it as oxygenated. And then that allows you, I think, as somebody that is within that problematic, that allows you a kind of agency that might be disruptive in a very surprising way. So, if you take the risk of actually re-signifying colonization in this other way, then perhaps it can go both ways. But perhaps it can oxygenate what right now feels very suffocating.
We're out of time, but I think that we can continue this conversation in a coffee break. I'd like to thank our speakers and thank you all for a productive exchange of ideas.
Oh, great.